Good afternoon, everyone.
It's really innovative. Yeah, yeah.
I'd like to welcome you
Peter.
to the Institute for Social Research's Martin Luther King Day celebration. This year's celebration is hosted and sponsored by the Research Center of Group Dynamics, and in particular, the Program for Research on Black Americans. Both James Jackson and Rich Gonzalez indicated to me that they were sorry that they were not able to make it today. I am Robert Taylor. I'm the director of the Program for Research on Black Americans. And my role today is quite simple. I'm going to introduce the moderator of this great esteemed panel. So David Wilson is our moderator. He's a Senior Associate Dean of Arts and Sciences at the University of Delaware. He's also a professor of political science and international relations. He previously was a senior statistical consultant for the Gallup organization, and his research focuses on race, gender, and class differences in public opinion and political attitudes. In addition, he has an extremely strong and impressive record of publications, grants, and is obvious by his title, University Service. Please welcome David Wilson.
Thank you for the introduction, and I'm always happy to be here at ISR. I came here at the University of Michigan the first time in 1993 and spent a summer at the Institute for Public Policy, and that was actually, in my career, the first time I had been around a place where there was a true commitment to academic excellence. I'm from the South. We get some of that. We don't get a lot of it, but academic excellence among people that were my peers. And so this place holds an important meaning to me, both as an institute and Ann Arbor more generally as a place of learning and intellectual skills. So my background is in political psychology. I study what goes on up here and how it affects everything out there. Mostly I use survey methodology. I use experiments to manipulate wording and question order, just to prove how contradictory we are as human beings, to really get at the sense of whether opinions matter, whether attitudes have substance, and whether beliefs actually translate to some form of behavior. It's ironic that in most of my academic background, people will mention most of my scholarly work, but my first job out of undergrad, and I'll say this because it's Martin Luther King federal holiday, and I played a big role in that actually. My first job out of undergrad was working for the Martin Luther King Federal Holiday Commission. And what most people don't realize is that in 1993, when Ronald Reagan signed into legislation the King National Holiday, a national holiday is not something that people have to observe. You just say it's a holiday. Do what you want. You don't have to let anybody off work. You don't have to commit to anything. It's just a national holiday. So the holiday was actually set to die essentially 5 years later. It had no real mandate beyond, all right, we'll do it and you can figure it out. And so my first job was as a legislative assistant, which means lobbyist, working for the commission to try and get Congress and other bodies to support a federal holiday, which means you have to commit time, resources, money, space. States have to sign on. You have to do stuff with flags, lower them or raise them higher and that kind of thing. So my first job actually was helping to see this Martin Luther King holiday become a reality. And it transitioned from this day where there were cookouts and people not going to work to this day of service where we commit to interracial cooperation, youth anti-violence initiatives, and basically community well-being research. So on this important day, we have a special occasion where we'll study some of these things. So as I'm actually a dean of social sciences at the University of Delaware, and we have 5 thematic frameworks for action that we study in the social sciences. Social justice, this notion that there are right or wrongs in society, and we should do something about these rights and wrongs sometimes. Public commitment or public service, this notion that we are a collective, even though we're a bunch of individuals, we still have collective responsibility to try and do something about the wrongs and rights of society. cultural understanding, the idea that while we're individuals, we're all different, and we should understand these differences in terms of language, technology, community, backgrounds, beliefs, and the like. Well-being, this notion that we all deserve a shot at having a happy and prosperous life, even though we always don't commit to it in many ways, whether it's the planet, the community, or the individuals. We care about these things about well-being. And social analysis, that we have methodologies, right? The Institute for Social Research. We have surveys, epidemiological studies, we have qualitative research, we have all kinds of forms of methods to understand society and how people respond to the different cues that are out there in the world. So in our panel, you can think about kind of our independent variable as cultural understanding. And you can think about our dependent variable as well-being. And you can think about the context as kind of social justice and the public commitment to social justice. And so I think our panelists will have quite a bit to say about these areas. So I'll briefly introduce our three panelists. Deanna Bird. Dr. Bird has backgrounds in both biological and social sciences, and her research focuses on racial disparities and cognitive health outcomes over the adult life course. She received a Ph.D. in community health sciences at UCLA. Please give Dr. Bird a round of applause. Chomping at the bit to tell you how this world works here. Good. Dr. Taylor Hargrove studies health disparities across the life course. She's specifically interested in health inequalities which are affected by race, skin color, gender, and social class. She received her PhD in sociology, medical sociology, from Vanderbilt University. Please welcome Dr. Hargrove. Dr. Lloyd Talley is a developmental psychologist who studies social policy. His work helps to conceptualize diversity within the Black population through the development of identity profiles, examining their relationships to social and health outcomes. He received his PhD in applied psychology and human development from the University of Pennsylvania. Please welcome Dr. Talley. So, as you've seen on the flyers, the title is MLK's Legacy for Social and Behavioral Science Research, Perspectives from New Scholars. So I've got quite a bit of leeway to kind of structure this panel. So anything that goes wrong you don't like, you can blame me for it. So I've asked Drs. Byrd, Hargrove, and Talley to stray from the traditional path of simply doing a research presentation and to focus more on their perspectives. How they got here, their traditional past, their inspirations, and ultimately their dreams for a broader society, what kinds of things their work should mean to make for an improved society. So without further delay, I'll ask Dr. Deanna Bird to come forward and present us with more.
So while my mic is getting queued up, can you guys hear me? I'll try not to stray. I like to move around, helps my nerves. I'm really honored to be here. I feel like I'm standing on the backs of my ancestors. So many great scholars and thinkers came before me, and so I just feel the weight of the people in the room and those that were here before me. My name is Deanna Bird, as our gracious hosts have introduced me, and I'm really humbled that you guys would be interested in the work I'm doing on cognition. It's very, very important. And before I begin, I really do want to give you a little bit of context of how I got to this stage. And that really came early on when I was studying at the University of Wisconsin, UW-Madison. I was working at that time for Dr. Dennis Mackey, who was the head of the infectious disease department. And then SARS happened. Not familiar with, anybody familiar with SARS? Heard of it? Okay, good. So SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome. When it happened in 2003, Dr. Dennis Mackey was actually asked by the president to go and be on a panel to see what we can do in terms of precautions and prevention efforts to prevent the spread of it, right? Some would argue that SARS was the first global epidemic of the 21st century because it had reached more than a dozen countries, Asia, North America, South America. And that was life-changing for me because I thought, wow, this amazing doctor is going to go and talk to the president and all these other scholars are going to be right with him. But who he worked with every single day was a public health epidemiologist who was actually in the hospital. They worked day and night to not only roll out the protocols that we used in the hospital in terms of the masks that were used, but then also he worked around the country in terms of what was used for airports and everything else. And it was at that moment that I decided I no longer wanted to study medicine. I wanted to have a much broader focus on an individual patient, and I actually wanted to have a public health impact. And so from there, I decided that I was going to study from a life course perspective. Unbeknownst to me at the time, I really was thinking about health disparities and, more importantly, health inequalities. And I thought to myself, well, why not begin at the very beginning, which is in infancy? And so I decided to, thank you. Okay. Can you guys hear me? Is that better? Better. I'll try to hold it. Are we good? Okay, I can move a little. And so I really decided to study infancy. And what I did was I looked at birth outcomes from an infant mortality perspective. What I first discovered was that Black women had a twofold greater risk of an infant death. And that wasn't in and of itself alarming, which it was just by itself. But then in addition to that, I looked at this effect of education. And what I essentially found was that education actually widened this gap, where college-educated Black women had a threefold greater risk of an infant death compared to college-educated white women. That bothered me because that was me. After all, I was pursuing my master's in Wisconsin, and why should it be just because of my race and that I decided to get a higher degree that I ultimately would be at risk of having my child die? So from there, I said, well, why don't I think about maybe the college environment? Maybe there's something happening there that's beyond just education in and of itself. Maybe that context mattered. And it did. I looked at racial tension, and I specifically did this study at UCLA. And what I found was that students who perceived a racially tense campus climate and then said that they had limited coping abilities, in fact, had worse mental health than students who said they felt like the environment was inclusive. So context matters. And from there, I then said, well, what happens when we move out of the lovely college environment, right, where everything is so great, and we actually move into the workforce, where our interpersonal interactions, to me, become even more salient? Because after all, you have to partner, you have to work on projects, you have to collaborate, you have to interact with people. And so what I looked at was whether or not discrimination, global discrimination, though discrimination due to race, gender, sexual orientation, and how that affected mental health. And what I found was just that, as I expected, higher levels of discrimination was tied to worse mental health in terms of higher levels of psychological distress. But that in and of itself, what was nuanced here was that this effect was weakest among Blacks. So let me state that in another way. The effect of discrimination was actually greater on the mental health of whites than it was of African Americans, even though they reported the highest levels of discrimination. So that got me to then thinking about maybe there's some resilience here. After all, I've been just looking at disparities and inequalities. Maybe there's something else I need to be considering that happens even as we get older. And that's where then I decided that I really wanted to focus on cognition. And this really came by way of my dissertation. But I still was looking from this lens of a disparity, so a Black-white comparison. And so for me, I really decided that I wanted to focus more specifically on Blacks, but I had to first step back and see whether or not we actually see these differences between Blacks and whites. And so before I jump in, I guess you might be asking yourself, why cognition? After all, I studied mental health and birth outcomes. Why did I kind of end towards the cognitive aspects of health? And for me, it was pretty straightforward. Cognition affects every other aspects of our health, right? Not just our mental health, our ability to make decisions, to successfully negotiate the world, to do these things that are very important, but it also affects our physical health, right? In terms of instrumental activities of daily living, our ability to care for ourselves, our ability to pay our bills. So for me, cognition was so much broader, and it really included the aspects of health that was most important to me in terms of how we just are able to survive. Because my mom would always say, after all, if your mind is tired, the body won't go anywhere. But if the body is tired, the mind can still do what it needs to do. So for the students in the audience, you're often told you're the face of the future. Guess what? You're not. This is the face of the future. I know, surprise. By 2030, we know that 1 in 5 adults are going to be 65 and older, and most importantly, this is what they're going to look like. We're realizing that the racial and ethnic minority older adults are going to nearly double in size. So I said to myself, why not focus on this huge demographic shift that we're already seeing and start to think about their needs, right? This is who we're going to be serving in terms of our healthcare system, our public health, and I hope as academicians and scholars where we're going to be thinking about in terms of intervention. So this is really my overall research agenda. It's what I'm focused on today, and really what I'm committed to is to reducing cognitive health burden among older Blacks in particular, and that's broadly speaking. I'm going to show you 2 studies. The first study really came out of my dissertation work where I was really interested in this between group comparison, comparing Black and white adults, and then the second study really focused on within group, looking specifically at disease burden within Blacks and how that affects cognitive changes over time. So I take you back to this nice little simple trajectory where we're referring to life course, and that's because the literature is actually really established here. This is no surprise. There are clearly disparities when we think about cognitive outcomes. In terms of Jennifer Weed, actually, she just came out about a year ago and clearly said that Blacks have a higher overall burden of cognitive disease. That includes mild cognitive impairment, that includes dementia. So this is very well established in terms of disparities at older ages. What is less established and has not necessarily been looked at is the age in which these disparities occur at younger age groups. Most of the studies to date have included adults 65 and older, so they haven't really included younger age groups. If that's the case, how do we know if a disparity is occurring at an earlier age? We don't, right? So that's what I was interested in answering with my first study was just that question. What ages do we see disparities emerge? And then this second question of within group comparison, again, the nexus between health status and cognitive changes over time. Okay, so here's this reference. I just have to take a minute to acknowledge the American Public Health Association for honoring me with an early investigator award. This is a panel, and I'm very grateful because when you're a new investigator and you're afraid to say, I want to do something different, people that are giants in the field, I'm saying that I think we should be looking at a totally different age group and that we should be much more inclusive, and everyone's saying, well, we're not doing that. It's a bit scary. But this ultimately helps us in thinking about how we serve the populations that we're working towards, right? So this is important. So really 2 objectives. First, determining if we see the disparities exist in alignment with the literature at the older age groups. And if we do, when do these disparities occur and do they persist? So not just cross-sectionally, but longitudinally as well. So I want to show you, this is the Americans Changing Lives, which came right out of here by James House, wonderful scholar and thinker that was the PI of this. And what I want to highlight, this is the baseline data. Okay, so the ACL ran for 25 years, 1986 to 2011, and it followed respondents that were 25 and older at baseline, right? So it included young, very young adults. And so what I'm highlighting here is really just to show you that even at baseline, Blacks come in with more chronic conditions, right? So for example, I highlight diabetes, it's nearly double. Just pay attention to that. I'll come back to why it's important. Okay, what did I find? So this is not adjusting for anything, just a very crude model. What we see here, cognitive errors, this is the short portable mental status questionnaire, a crude measure of cognitive decline. And what we see is that overall Blacks are making more cognitive errors, so they're doing worse, age being on the x-axis. What we see is when we adjust for sociodemographic, other health risk factors, attrition, the number of waves participated in, right? This was 25 years period, right? So about 5 waves. What we see is a similar pattern, but what's important here is the age at which we see a divergence. As you can see, that's at age 45. So what's the takeaway here? First, similar to what other studies have already well established, that yes, at baseline, there are robust differences between Blacks and whites, Blacks being at a disadvantage. In this context, age 75, which is where I centered age at. That was arbitrary. But the most important thing is when we're beginning to identify these disparities, which we see happening actually in midlife. And more importantly, we see that not only is it happening earlier than what we previously thought, but we're actually seeing that these disparities widen and they continue. If you go back, this widening pattern here, obviously, even at older ages. So we're seeing that blacks not only begin to do worse, but they continue. Okay, so what I then thought to myself, well, maybe it has something to do with the disease burden that blacks are already disproportionately facing in terms of higher diabetes, chronic conditions. Is that driving the larger differences when we compare them to blacks and whites, right? When we do this between group comparison. So I was interested really from this perspective of individual level variability in health, right? So if we can understand at an individual level, then we can obviously extrapolate that to a larger level and see if that maybe drives the between group differences. So I looked essentially at that. Is disease burden associated with cognitive decline over time when you look just at a sample of blacks? So here's this reference, and this really comes from a sample that was based in Baltimore. Here's the baseline data for that. Now, these blacks were followed for about 2.5 years apart. The initial sample was 600 blacks, and the second wave was 450 blacks. What I highlight here again is even in this sample of Black Americans, what you're seeing at wave 1, for example, over 80% of the sample reported coming in and having hypertension. Right? So even if you take a sample, a nationally representative sample, such as the Americans Changing Lives from the first study, and this sample, which is based in Baltimore, you're seeing a similar pattern, right? Where blacks are coming in overall less healthy. And what did I find? Basically, what I found was that blacks who had 2 or more health conditions, or at least who self-reported it that way, had significantly slower perceptual speed than those who reported 1 or no conditions. And other measures too. For example, I also found that lung functioning was associated with cognitive changes, right? So other indicators of health, not just self-reported chronic health conditions, but lung functioning, for example, also had an effect on cognition over time. So just to recap, what I've basically told you is that we know that blacks basically are doing worse at baseline and over time. We know that these disparities are emerging earlier in the life course than what we previously identified. That's important in terms of thinking about who we're including in our study samples. And we also know that when we look specifically within blacks, that greater disease burden is in fact associated with declines in specific cognitive domains. Now, I've just told you all of this and you say, well, how is this really connected to what your vision is for MLK and what you would like to see? And I do this at 3 levels. First, at an individual level. So my grandparents were sharecroppers. I come from the Deep South. My mother picked cotton. I'm the first in my family to obtain a Ph.D., which was a huge feat. You know, I'm the first to even go out to LA and move there and be all by myself. And, you know, my mother would always say, you have nothing to worry about. You just take this one saying with you and you'll be fine. Well, that's true, but it took a lot more, right? So my vision is that we actually act on this. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I think if we actually lived that, then the way we interacted with people would be very different. If we thought about, wow, I'm going to be on the receiving end of that one day, then the way that I give off to another person would matter. And then at an institutional level, this is really important, especially being in academia. I know my own journey as a student, but thinking about racial equality and funding in terms of support and tenure and promotion, across all of these, there's inequalities. The NIH just came out with a report that said that Black scholars and Black academicians are funded at a much lower rate than white faculty. And in fact, they're penalized when they study things such as community-based participatory research or when they do things such as health disparities, the very thing that I'm interested in. And why is that? Again, it kind of reminds me of my early days when I was reporting on the statistic of college-educated Black women having a 3-fold greater risk of an infant death compared to college-educated white women. And then the elimination of health disparities. I really started my early work focused on identifying disparities, and that was really important to me. And then I realized that I no longer wanted to identify a disparity, but I wanted to understand it. Why is it that we're seeing the differences? That's in part why I really focus on Black Americans and the individual variability in their health, because we can't compare people and just say that that's enough and then stop there. So my next dream would really be the elimination of health disparities. Why aren't we working towards that? I think that that's really important. Hopefully my work wouldn't be needed, right, if we didn't have health disparities. And so my final thoughts, I always end with students because, you know, as much as academics love to hear themselves talk, Who are we talking to? We are talking to students and the next generation, at least I am. And so academia definitely needs you. So for those who are considering already on the path, please continue. Academia is still very homogeneous. It's still very white and it's still very male. So we need to change that. I'm committed to it. I hope you are as well. This is the currency. It took me a while to learn this. So be gentle with yourself. I think people expect that you come in and you just know what you're supposed to do, and you don't. And that's okay. But this right here is the most important thing I think I can tell you if you want to pursue to be a scholar, is you have to write. Many great scholars started out by their words, right? Martin Luther King, right? His speech was written, right? Great orators take a lot of time on their words, and so should you. So write, and write some more. I have to thank Dr. Gilbert G., my former chair, who told me that. And then finally, if you remember nothing else I say today, this is the most important. Insecurity shows up much quicker than confidence. So believe in yourself. No matter what people tell you, it is true. If you do believe in yourself, you'd be surprised of the outcome. I mean, after all, if you don't believe in yourself, who will? So I debated on who to end with, and since you probably have heard a lot of quotes today by MLK, I decided to end with W.T.B. Des Moines, one of the original thinkers in terms of Black health, the first study, sociological studies in Philadelphia on Black Americans and their health conditions, and really what drives me to do my work. He said the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. I hope that you will join me in my endeavor to change this, because we have so many problems in the 21st century, from the environment, politics, and everything else. Why can't we just take race out the equation? Thank you so much.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all are doing well on this very special day. I am super honored to be here. Like Dr. Wilson said, I was trained at Vanderbilt University, but I've always felt a special connection to Michigan. I was never formally trained here, but I do know a lot of scholars that have come through here that have remained here, great people like Dr. Robert Taylor. So I consider Michigan, whether it considers me, kind of a second home. So it's really exciting to be here. Also, as Dr. Wilson mentioned, I was trained as a sociologist, so I have a bit of a different perspective probably than some of the other panelists that will speak with you. But I'm also housed at UNC, Chapel Hill, so I'm, I think, the only one who's pretty out of town. So to date, my research has really sought to address ongoing questions related to links between multiple disadvantaged social statuses and health inequalities at different stages of the life course, right? And just to give you all a bit of an idea of how I arrived at these interests, a lot of it was personal. So I'm originally from Baltimore, Maryland. Anyone from Baltimore, Maryland, DC? Okay. Well, any kind of big city could probably relate to this, but I saw one side of Baltimore, right? So this is the aquarium, which is in the Inner Harbor that you visit on field trips. This is Camden Yards, where the Baltimore Orioles play baseball team. This is actually a picture of the high school that I went to, Friends School of Baltimore, Quaker School. This is one of the malls in the Inner Harbor. One of our prestigious markets that's located in a very affluent neighborhood. These are one of the crab houses that people will frequent, right, to have some good crabs and seafood. So I grew up going to all of these types of things, right? But I also grew up with headlines like this, right, where Baltimore cities don't even have air conditioning for their students and having to close early because it's too hot for children to be there, right? I also would pass these types of homes going to my grandmother's house, right? Very dilapidated, corner stores that sold liquor and cigarettes that tended to be clustered in particular types of communities, unkempt, right, types of houses. This is actually a picture of the church that I went to growing up in Baltimore. Actually, it had to stop its nighttime visuals because of the drug activity that was going on outside of the church halls, right? And so this was kind of a two-sided perspective that I had. And a lingering question for me as I was growing up was, why is this? Why, on the one hand, am I going to this very kind of elite school with technology and whatnot, and I have friends who go to other schools that don't have paper to write on, right? And so I eventually learned that all these differences in neighborhoods and schools and in churches that I was seeing culminated into very serious health risks, right? And that had significant consequences for one's quality of life. So what you're looking at here is kind of the health prospects of residents living in two different neighborhoods. One being Roland Park, which is a very affluent neighborhood where my school is located, and another neighborhood, which is maybe 5 or 6 miles away, uptown Druid Heights. Residents in Roland Park could expect to live to age 83 on average, whereas residents of Druid Heights could expect to live 20 years fewer, right? So an average age of 36. People who grew up in Druid Heights were 3 times more likely to have heart disease, 8 times more likely to have diabetes, 15 times more likely to die by homicide, and 20 times more likely to have HIV and AIDS, right? Again, these are communities that are 5-10 minutes away from each other. And so then I went to grad school to pursue a doctorate in sociology, right? Because I was really interested in understanding these types of what I came to know as social determinants of health, right? Things like neighborhoods and schools. And so I was drawn to sociology because of the field's emphasis on power and structure, right? So how these things really shape the conditions of our life that influence health and well-being, how these things shape our relationships and interactions with one another, our opportunities, and our overall quality of life. And one of the first readings I remember doing in grad school that really stuck with me was Jay Pearson's Can't Buy Me Whiteness. Has anyone read this piece back in 2008? No? Okay, well, I'll give you a quick summary. So this article, I think, did a beautiful job of challenging the universal applicability of what has been and is still considered a very robust, strong relationship in the health literature, which is the relationship between socioeconomic status and health, right? And so he presents evidence showing that this relationship between socioeconomic status and health doesn't look the same for racial and ethnic minorities as it does for whites, right? And how this relationship shouldn't be something that's considered paradoxical, right? Which is what scholars would have argued, just saying, oh, it doesn't fit among racial and ethnic minorities, so something must be wrong with them, right? Not the actual relationship. But Jay Pearson goes on to argue that this weak relationship between SES and health for non-whites is really a result of historical legacies and contemporary factors that differentiate the meanings of traditional socioeconomic indicators like education and income. And so this was really something that resonated with me, right? Coming from a background in which my family's middle class status looked very different and felt very different than those of my middle class white counterparts who I went to school with, right? And so from then on, I became really passionate about kind of unpacking and complicating, these well-known relationships in the health literature to better understand the unique pathways to health among all kinds of social groups. So my research thus far, and most likely in the future, is kind of squarely situated within the literature on racial stratification and health, right? And in this literature, it's not uncommon to see that Black-white disparities are often unexplained when controlling for things like socioeconomic status, health behaviors, as we saw from some of Dr. Bird's work, right? Kind of these well-known determinants of health. And so part of why we get these residual gaps, right, so these unexplained remaining gaps in health is because most of our studies examining racial inequality have been comparative, right? So comparing one minority group to whites normally. And while this certainly gives us a lot of great information, this is what the bulk of our knowledge is based on, it undertakes a certain type of assumption, right? And it gives us a certain type of information because what it's doing is that it's assuming that members of a similar racial group or gender group are impacted by social factors in an equivalent manner, right? And therefore experience the social world in the same way. And that is an untenuous assumption. Right, and it also masks heterogeneity in health that exists among these broadly defined social groups, whether that be racial group, gender groups, and consequently that actually might obscure the full nature and extent of racial inequalities. And so my research to date, again, has taken two types of approaches to better understand this type of heterogeneity. One approach has been to apply an intersectionality perspective to really understand the joint consequences of social statuses like race, ethnicity, skin color, gender, social class, to understand both these inter and intra group disparities along this set of important social characteristics. And then another line of my work has taken a more explicit within group approach to studying health equality among African Americans in particular, to uncover these unique pathways to health among this group. I'm going to go over a few of the findings from my research that I found particularly interesting. And so this first set of findings comes from that intersectionality approach. And so what we're going to see here are age trajectories of body mass index by the intersections of race, ethnicity, and gender among white, Black, and Hispanic men and women, ages 13 to 31. And what we see is that for men, there's an expected relationship, right? So the solid white line is white men. This line with boxes is for Black men, and then this line with diamond points is for Hispanic men. So Black and Hispanic men tend to have higher BMIs across this early part of the life course than their white counterparts. Kind of no surprise there. What is interesting is that white women tend to have the most advantaged BMI trajectories across this age range. Black women have the worst trajectory across the age range. And Latina women fall somewhere in between. And what's important to take away from this is, it might be a little hard to see here, but there's actually larger racial and ethnic disparities among women than men. Black women and Hispanic women are particularly disadvantaged, as well as Hispanic men, right? And so Blacks and Hispanics aren't, as a whole, uniformly disadvantaged, right? There are quite a few differences. This same paper also looks at how wealth plays a role. And so what we're looking at here is how race, ethnicity, and wealth combine among men. And so for white men, we see what we would expect, right? So the wealthiest white men have the lowest or the most advantaged BMI trajectory, right? And we see this gradient where the worst trajectory is among the least wealthy white men. And we see the exact opposite for Hispanic men. So this line is actually for the wealthiest Hispanic men. They have the most disadvantaged BMI trajectory in early life. This is Hispanic men with kind of middle range wealth, and then this is Hispanic men with the lowest levels of wealth, who are actually exhibiting lower BMIs, healthier BMIs than their wealthier counterparts, right? And so across this age range of 13 to 31, wealthy Hispanic men actually experience a 12-point increase in their BMI compared to an 8-point increase among their white counterparts, an 8-point increase among non-wealthy whites, right? And a 7-point increase among non-wealthy Hispanic men. Going to be the same kind of trajectory plot, but for among women, and we're going to be comparing white and Black women. So for white women of all wealth levels, the results suggest they follow a similar trajectory. Here's the line for wealthy Black women, middle kind of wealth levels of Black women, and non-wealthy Black women, right, who again are seeing the lowest levels or the most advantaged BMI trajectories, which is the exact opposite of what the social determinants literature would suggest, right? You think the more wealth that you would have, the better your health would be, and that is not what we're seeing at all for minority women. So what starts off as a 3-point difference in BMI between white and Black women at age 13 grows to a 9-point difference at age 31, which is young, right? Okay, so these next sets of findings are going to come from the more explicit within group approach. So looking at African Americans in particular, using the Cardia study, looking at BMI by skin color. And so what we see for light and medium skinned women, this is their BMI trajectory from the 30s to the 50s. For dark skinned women, it is much worse, right? For light skinned men, they experience a more advantaged BMI trajectory. For medium-skinned men, an even better trajectory. And then dark-skinned men are overlapping with light-skinned men. And so one way to think about these types of disparities is to look at age-equivalent profiles. So among women, for example, it takes about 23 years for a lighter-skinned woman to have the BMI profile of a young, dark-skinned woman. right? So said differently, a 55-year-old light-skinned or medium-skinned woman, has the BMI profile of a 32-year-old dark-skinned woman, right? And so we see a similar gap, not as big, but a similar gap among men, where medium-skinned men actually have the BMI profile of their light and dark-skinned counterparts 13 years later. These next sets of findings are actually from a brand new project that I've been working on, both independently and with several collaborators. It's based on a grant that we were just awarded from NIH, looking at mobility contexts, right? So how much the county that you grew up in allows for socioeconomic mobility. And this is kind of harping back to my interest from the Pearson 2008 piece and seeing how these educational gradients by race or what they look like and if they depend on a particular type of context in which one was raised. So I know this is a lot going on in this slide. I'm going to walk you through it. But on the left, what we're looking at are two sets of results for whites. And the outcome is cardiometabolic risk. So this is really a biological indicator of physiological aging, right? So higher levels indicate poor health. And what we're seeing is for whites, no matter what kind of mobility context they grew up in, higher educated individuals always have a health benefit, right? So they have lower levels of cardiometabolic risk. And the same thing holds for depressive symptoms. So at these growing up in both high and low mobility contexts, college educated and whites experience fewer depressive symptoms. Be a bit of a different story for blacks, right, where it really does depend on the mobility context in which they were raised. So African Americans who grew up in these in low mobility contexts, there's no significant educational gradient. So it doesn't matter that you've achieved a college education. And for blacks who grew up in a high mobility context, those who go on to attain a college education do see some health benefit, right? But only in that particular kind of. For depressive symptoms, it's actually the exact opposite. So African Americans who grew up in these high mobility places, there's no significant educational difference in young adulthood. But for African Americans who grew up in these low mobility contexts, those who go on to attain a college degree actually experience a mental health benefit. And then the last graph I'll show you is for Hispanics, who kind of fall somewhere in the middle. And so for their physical health, so their cardiometabolic risk, higher education is generally associated with better health, right, regardless of the mobility context. But for depressive symptoms, there really is only a mental health benefit of higher education among the low mobility, among individuals who grew up in low mobility contexts, right? And so just to summarize that kind of wealth of findings, right? So for whites, the educational disparities are quite robust, right? It doesn't matter what kind of context that they're growing up in, higher education is always linked to better outcomes. For blacks and Hispanics, it depends on the context. So higher education among blacks is associated with better physical health only among those who grew up in counties that facilitate mobility, right? And the exact opposite is true when we're thinking about mental health. For Hispanics, higher education is generally associated with better physical health, but these results are actually driven by foreign-born Hispanics, right? So thinking about nativity processes. And so U.S.-born Hispanics actually follow a similar pattern to U.S.-born blacks when thinking about these links between context and education and health. And the last set of findings that I'll show you comes from a project that I actually presented here. It must have been last semester, looking at how different dimensions of race influence health disparities. And so what we're looking at is disparities in psychological distress. And so if we were to clump all African Americans together, we would conclude that blacks tend to have lower psychological distress than whites, right? But we disaggregate this by skin color. The groups that are only experiencing these lower levels of psychological distress are those rated as having dark or very dark brown skin, right? So lighter skinned African Americans actually have comparable levels of psychological distress to whites. When we incorporate context into these types of patterns, so looking at the proportion of black residents in one's census tract, right? So for whites who grew up in high proportion black neighborhoods, they see a bit of a bump in their psychological distress, but the difference is negligible. Blacks who are rated as having medium brown skin actually see a drastic decrease in psychological distress in adulthood if they grew up in high proportion Black neighborhoods. And then we see a similar story for African Americans rated as having dark brown skin. If we look at the flip side, so looking at how growing up at different levels of proportion of white residents plays an influence. So for whites, the more residents that live in their census tract, the lower their psychological distress levels. For medium skin and dark skin African Americans, the pattern is the exact opposite, right? So for medium and dark skin African Americans who live in high proportion white neighborhoods, they're actually experiencing relatively high levels of psychological distress. Okay, so I'm going to end. I think I have about 3 minutes left for what my dream or dreams are for the social world moving forward. And these are kind of lofty, probably not as attainable as I probably could have been, but we'll just go along with it. So my first dream is to really eliminate excess suffering among marginalized communities and groups, right? And so another striking fact that I learned during grad school that has really always stuck with me as well is the degree of excess mortality that exists, right? Or the deaths that could have been avoided, that could have been avoided by social factors, right? And so there was a study done back in 2004 that found if African Americans had the health of whites in the US, over 880,000 deaths could have been avoided. Right? And we can compare that to about 177,000 deaths that were saved by medical advances. And so just to put this in another kind of perspective, David Williams actually compares these excess deaths to a Boeing 767 plane, so a regular sized plane that you, I'm sure, have all been on, being shot out of the sky and everyone on board dying, right? And this occurring every day for a year. And everyone on board is Black. That's how many excess deaths that we're talking about. That is directly attributable to social determinants, right? So there's a dire need to really address the social factors that are playing a role in these very stark health inequalities. So this leads me to my next point. I really hope for equal access to quality of life, whether that be quality education or schools, quality neighborhoods, workplaces, but just giving everyone the same opportunity to have that healthy living. And then my last point is that I hope that one day we do live in a world that's free from biases and their pathogenic effects, right? So this is one thing that Dr. Martin Luther King explicitly preached, right? That people may be judged by, not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, right? And so we know that these judgments from the social statuses that we have or that we're ascribed and the treatments that result from these types of judgments are particularly toxic and can be deadly, right? Especially for marginalized groups. So I hope that we do see a world one day where these kinds of biases are eradicated. Up there, right at 20 minutes.
Good afternoon, ISR. How are you all? I am so excited to be here today. I'm new to the University of Michigan, and I just want to first shout out my research mentor, Dr. Daphne Watkins from the Curtis Center. She's here to support me. I came to Michigan about 8 months ago or so in June, and my first thing that I did when I came here was I attended ICPSR. And so I'm just so happy to be back in the room that has been providing so much great methodological empowerment and uplift, but also to be at ISR, where I think throughout the course of my presentation today, you'll see that a lot of the foundations and what I'm hoping to advance further have been generated here. And so, of course, today we'll be talking about Dr. Martin Luther King, but the title of my presentation is actually Unpacking Risk and Resilience in Urban Black Emerging Adult Men, a Quantitative Intersectional Analysis. And so many of us know Dr. King from his I Have a Dream speech, and I know that today we will be talking about my dream for stronger trajectories to well-being and resilience for Black men. But more so than Dr. King's words in his I Have a Dream speech, my work is really drawn on Dr. King's movement from a theologian to an interdisciplinarian. Something that I hope that we all as a field will consistently move from just our kind of silos oftentimes in our discipline to really understanding the breadth and the context of the things that are affecting all of the outcomes regarding health that we're interested in. So here you'll see a photo of Dr. King when he's graduating from Morehouse College, when he is really a theologian, but then he takes this huge leap across his lifespan to really start to begin to understand how prejudice and religion and capitalism all really start to meld together to shape these disparity trajectories that we see that our speakers before have kind of outlined so clearly. And so hopefully today we'll take you through a little bit of a walk, not only through my work from student to scholar, but also through what some of my hope is for this work that I've been working on for about the past 6 to 7 years. And so personally, I did not begin in academia. And so oftentimes people talk about academics, and because I'm young, some people are like, oh, you just went straight through school. And for me, it was like, no, there was a little bit more that built this over time. And so I'm from New York. And so I've been studying Black manhood since I was a child, just by being a part of these environments that have kind of cued me to seeing not only my development, but my development in context of my peers' development, my development in terms of how my trajectories were different than those who were close to me, but then even more so opening up Pandora's box when I went to Howard University as an undergrad. Because the narratives that I heard oftentimes in the environment about Black men didn't really look like my community, and then when I got to Howard, they definitely did not adhere to the diversity of men that I saw at the university. And so at first I said social policy is the way, government is the way, and I actually started work at the Export-Import Bank of the United States, a very small federal agency that does export policy. But there, I saw the power of policymakers and researchers to build the narratives that we use to make our policies in the country. And so after that, I said, okay, well, the policy thing was nice, but maybe I should be in the field talking to people, shaking hands, really learning if the disparities that I'm seeing in my mind and the way that the research and the things that I'm learning in academia don't always align with my personal world. I decided to go into the field. And so I joined President Obama's 2012 campaign in Nevada, and then Cory Booker's Senate special election. And so I say all that to say, my work is not necessarily just driven towards understanding the disparities, but how do we move from a disparity to a translational space where we're actually taking the knowledge that we have and we're putting it into the environment to really shape the lives of young Black men. And I think here the knowledge from PRBA, NSAL, so on and so forth over the years has laid an immense trajectory for that. But now I think it's time for us to take another step, right? And so when I left the university, I decided to go into lobbying. So I was the Pennsylvania State Outreach Director for Students First, a nonprofit that if you know anything about DC, you know about Michelle Rhee, you'll just know that I got out of there as fast as I possibly could. And what I realized there was that there were a lot of, as we know, well-intentioned advocates in the youth development and education space. And as I was sitting there, I said, well, they don't really know what they're talking about, because they don't, meaning that they weren't living the life that I was living, but they were writing policies for young men who looked like me, but I didn't either. And so I said, let me take a step back from policy to pursue my master's at the University of Pennsylvania, where I worked under Dr. Howard Stevenson. But there, I started to really pick up this notion that intervention in research is a thing, right? It's not just about looking at things on a piece of paper and being able to interpret them and have scholars who have brilliant minds who really can contextualize and explain the processes that we see, but also that we can do something about this in real time, and we don't have to wait until the 30th year of a longitudinal study to actually be able to do that all the time. And so I got my Ph.D. in human development after studying education, culture, and society, and now I'm here at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. So at the core, this problem that I've been having over time is that very often in society, we see these very polarized narratives of Black men. So we see them as victims, we see them as criminals, and then we even see the commercialization of their success to bring these larger narratives around funding, philanthropy. But in all actuality, we really see that young Black men experience what we call a precarious emergence, right? That generally they do not have a space in our society where they are securely held, right? That they are very likely to not have the opportunity to be resilient, to fall into risk categories, primarily because the supports are not there to ensure their healthy development. And we as a field, I think, still have to come together to decide what that trajectory, what that blueprint really looks like. And so why do I call it a precarious emergence? Well, unfortunately, at the ages of 18 to 30 years of age, we see a rapid accrual of risks for young Black men. And it's funny because when I was in graduate school, I mostly was looking at adolescents. And then once they got out of school and they weren't in a college setting, we had no research on Black men from their perspectives that was really looking at the things that were critical for their development over time. And so the thing that was most alarming to me at first was the increase in Black male incarceration at the age of between 18 and 30 years of age, and then the fact that the correctional population in the United States was predominantly consisting of young Black men. But as I thought about this from a contemporary lens, I said, this can't be new, right? This has to be something that we've seen over time, especially if it's concentrated at this developmental stage. And so I went to the literature from Du Bois specifically, and I was in graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania, so I said, well, the data I'll be using is from Philly, so let me find out what Du Bois had to say early about these experiences for young Black men. And so we see the similar patterns, right, in terms of incarceration, in terms of the convicts in the penitentiary. And so obviously the environment perceives young Black men as risky, they perceive them as threatening, but at the same time, it's not necessarily clear why these disadvantages are accruing at this life course stage, right? And so we have these really interesting, kind of litany of things that's going on here, but this was really driven by my own personal experience. So being from New York, across my life course, I've seen a number of really challenging things in this public sphere, but then it really started to hit home first when Mike Brown was killed. And then also my cousin, who actually was incarcerated, he got out of jail and maybe about 6 months after was shot dead in Maryland. And then his brother, who was actually just released from jail very recently, but followed a similar trajectory. And then my younger stepbrother, actually, when he was suffering mental health challenges in New York, they took him to Rikers, and then they wound up killing him. And so the fact that all of these things are accruing, I said, I need to understand what's going on with boys and young men of color, both in the context as well as what's going on in their everyday lives. And so, yes, we've had this very interesting development over the course of the past few years where we see a lot of work around boys and young men of color. Tons of money is being thrown into the philanthropic space to support boys and young men of color, specifically the Campaign for Black Male Achievement. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has a Forward Promise initiative. However, when we look at the literature, there are a number of gaps. And so we're pouring money into an enterprise at this point in time where we know funders are fickle in terms of what outcomes they would like to see. But we haven't really addressed certain gaps in our own research that would actually allow us to use those funds appropriately, especially when we know that they're not coming necessarily from the federal government. They're coming from private organizations that want to see outcomes relatively quickly. And so some of the major issues were that we really weren't taking an intersectional look at Black men. Right? We were doing race or gender comparative work, so we have a lot of work here at the university on Black racial identity, but it wasn't necessarily considered in the context of masculinity intersecting with that or femininity intersecting with that. But then we also have a lot of college enrolled or educated samples. And the majority of African American, the majority of the United States is not college educated. And so if context matters in the way that we understand people's behaviors, then the literature that we have available does not really speak to the experiences of Black men who are not enrolled in college. And then finally, a lot of the work that we're doing is it focuses on linear. We use a lot of regression-based approaches, and to an extent, that assumes homogeneity within a certain category. If you just fall at a certain place on a spectrum from 1 to 5, without thinking about, well, how might another one of your characteristics actually alter the outcome based off of the different dimensions of inequity or marginalization that you experience, and also people not really thinking about masculinity as a risk factor, meaning that engaging in hegemonic masculinity as a risk factor for Black men, not that they want to do it, but that the social context actually provides that as a way for them to survive, and then it winds up having much more risk outcomes at the end of the day. And so our key challenges around this are, one, that there's this sparse research. There's also a limited preparedness of youth advocates, teachers, so on and so forth, to address this. And really, we don't have a unified plan for the lifespan development of Black men. And so this is what I present as something called the Kaleidoscope Vision. where we see all these beautiful things, all this beautiful research that's happening on Black men, programs, philanthropic efforts, and you see it and it looks great, but then in actuality, it's fragmented, right? It's not really a cohesive, gelled picture, and it actually obscures your vision towards the problem. And so having all of these different pieces really said to me that we are, like Ellison often said, are distorted and fragmented. And Ellison puts it so beautifully. He says, I'm invisible, you see, simply because people refuse to see me. And he talks about hard, distorting glass shaping the way that people see Black men. And each of our individual lenses in some way is a reflective mirror, right? But it doesn't necessarily help us to form a holistic perspective. And so generally it looks like, in my opinion, this, right? And my goal in my research is actually to move it from this to this. And so the core research program questions that I have are: one, how can we understand within group diversity among Black men in order to develop targeted interventions? And then how do we prepare and sustain male educators and mentors of color to support those men? And so we'll get into the research now. And I'm giving you this broad level because my study, interestingly enough, for my dissertation, I got a lot of pushback from my advisors because I studied 4 domains of outcome. Because in my mind, if identity is central to the way that people navigate the world, then yes, understanding what's going on in depression or what's going on in sexual health risk or what's going on in substance use individually may be nice, but isn't it a much more robust picture if we understand how the same group of men are experiencing all of these challenges so that we have a more clear and focused viewpoint of what we can do? And so I'll go quickly through the next aspects of it, because I think most of you probably will get the importance of Black emerging adulthood for young men. But there is little research on emerging adulthood. So emerging adulthood actually has become a newer addition to the life course in the research, really the period between 18 and 30, whereas before we kind of used to bucket that with young adulthood or we bucketed it with adolescence. We've now started to parse it out. And really, the interesting aspect of emerging adulthood is that it really focuses on the fact that there are a lot of interpersonal and social aspects that shift dramatically for young adults as they move out of the somewhat protected space of adolescence into everyday life. And especially Arnett and Brody argue that for emerging adults who are African American, this passage is what they call fraught. Meaning that because identity is a central piece of the transition to adulthood, that having a context that does not support your identity development is detrimental to your health. And oftentimes we look at identity development as a link towards other health well-being outcomes, when in all actuality, the synthesis of identity from the early literature on Erikson, so the ability to see yourself in this case as Black, and as male, and from an urban environment, and with a certain educational level, that synthesis is really what carries someone through the life course, not themselves feeling fragmented. And so just briefly, I think that it's interesting that Arnett and Brody really focus on the fact that these issues are especially acute for African American emerging adults due to the injection of discrimination and prejudice. And the reason why I highlight that is because oftentimes when I do my presentations, people will say, well, what about the context, right? What about the global? And that should be taken as an assumption of the work, right? The work is assuming that these men are in a precarious state because of where they are. And so I'm going to kind of just pass forward on that a little bit because I know that it's something that we'll be able to talk about in the panel, but the notion that we're removing the context from this is the opposite, completely the opposite of what we're doing here. And so this is Erikson's initial conceptualization of the life course. And so often today we've seen kind of this maybe by numbers or in the longitudinal, from the longitudinal lens. But really now we have this new, this new and emerging aspect of the life course where it focuses on experimentation and risk-taking. So if we're worried about risk and resilience in young Black men, we have to think about it from a developmental perspective. So risk-taking is the way that one individuates. It's the second individuation aspect of the life course. Why is that important? Well, it's important because sometimes when we think about risky outcomes for young Black men, we think about it as if we should have a zero baseline, right? That no risk should be occurring. But that doesn't allow us to actually recognize that risk-taking is a major aspect of becoming an adult. And so oftentimes when we think about health disparities or health risk, it's not that there should be no risk-taking happening. It's that the risks that are happening should be resilience inspired, right? They should be leading towards the ability for someone to thrive through different risky situations without faltering later on in life. And so it's absolutely necessary. And identity at its core is the critical psychosocial task. It is the organizing structure of self, and it orchestrates our behavior. And so if we want to understand the behavior of young Black men, it's important that we focus on how their identity development processes are occurring. Typically, we have some really interesting approaches to race and gender. I'll scroll through them, but we know a lot about the fact that masculinity leads to, or hegemonic masculinities often lead to aggression and violence. But then conversely, we find that when a young person has a very high or positive racial identity, their outcomes are improved. So if we wanted high masculinity and high racial identity for Black men, it might be a little bit of a paradox of outcomes, because we want to impress upon young men the value of being a man, but also their racial identity. And what it winds up doing, what we'll see in a moment, is it actually winds up putting them in more of a risky condition rather than a more nuanced or more holistic view of manhood and masculinity. And so we'll scroll through these. I think I've said enough about this. But the last aspect of this is that we often are also forgetting the importance of masculine gender role stress, that it's not just masculinity and it's not just racial identity, but it's also the stressors that occur. And so we finally get to intersectionality and Black manhood. And so Lisa Bolek asks a really important question, and she puts it in the form of a math problem. And she says, does Black lesbian woman equal a Black plus lesbian plus woman? Does it equal Black lesbian woman? And the question in this case is, for me, is, does being an urban person, a Black person, an emerging adult man, does that lead to a full understanding of someone as an urban Black emerging adult man? And my answer is no. Mostly because intersectionality requires that we analyze the matrix of domination and respect the fact that people are lived social groups, right? And that we may not be comparing them, or we may not even want to compare them to one another, because knowing what's going on within the group might actually help us when we try to move to application, right? It might actually help us to understand who to target, what programs at, or what interventions, or what treatments. And so we know enough about intersectionality, I believe, drawing from legal and law studies, but our common approaches have been social determinants approaches, health disparities approaches, or interactive, where we're using regressions to kind of figure out how different social statuses interact with each other. But Griffith advances it and says, no, well, let's take it a little bit further and just focus on how intersectionality can be applied to men. And here he says that it's not just race or gender, but it's race and gender. That goes into someone's economic status, but also their exposures and their responses to stressors, which lead to health disparities or disparities in behavior. And he argues that we should take a life course development perspective that takes into account all of these different aspects. And so from the study that I'll present today, and I'll go through the findings because we'll have some time to talk about it, but I really wanted to apply a person-centered and multidimensional view of identity to understand if there were unique subgroups within a population of African-American men, rather ideological subgroups, thinking about the way that they thought, thinking about the way that they would navigate the world, rather than saying all of these men should be the same, or we're going to assume that because they're from the same context, they are the same. And so the first the three dimensions that we used were something called Black male vulnerability salience, the awareness of a Black man about how risky the world could be for him. We can't assume for every Black man that he has a high awareness or a low awareness of that, even if he lives in an urban environment. Then we have hypermasculine ideology endorsement, or endorsement of hegemonic masculinity, recognizing that young Black men, some endorse the values of hegemonic masculinity and some do not, and that we need to understand how these things are interacting with each other rather than just assuming that that every Black man stands at a certain point on this spectrum. And then masculine gender role stress appraisal. And why is that? Because how many people have ever been in New York City? I'm from New York. Anybody? So, sometimes people step on your shoes and train, and you have to make a decision in that split moment if you're going to hit that person or not. If that stress of that person challenging your being is worth it or not. And what we found in the literature is that all three of these things are what are informing Black men's behavior every single day. And so I decided to explore sociodemographic differences, emotional risk differences, and 4 domains of risk-taking: violence, sexual health, alcohol use, and drug use, primarily through something called latent profile analysis. And so this here is drawing on Margaret Spencer's phenomenological variant of ecological systems framework, in which she posits that we have to look at someone's vulnerability level, their stress, and their coping processes in order to, within a group, understand patterned and diverse outcomes. And so how did I translate this? I took those same aspects and I looked at emotional risk, violence, sexual attitudes and behaviors, substance abuse, and alcohol use. Within one study. I know, I did a lot. But we used some data from a barbershop project in Philadelphia. 597 heterosexual men, 18 to 24 years of age, most at an income below $20,000 and 61% unemployed. So we wanted to get a real community sample here. And so in applying this person-centered view, we developed the latent classes. We looked at our identity constructs. And then we really wanted to look at how these actually work towards the prediction of these outcomes. Are there subgroup differences in these outcomes? And so, our results. The first question was, can there be heterogeneous subpopulations? The answer is yes. There were 4 heterogeneous subpopulations that we identified. And those 4 heterogeneous subpopulations that we identified, I termed diffuse, balanced, strained, and distressed. And as you can see here, the distress profile was highest on all of the outcomes when compared to the rest of the group, with the diffuse being the lowest. Meaning that these are, relative to the rest of the group, how they fall on the dimensions of vulnerability salience, ideology endorsement, and stress appraisal. What we found was that the diffuse group was low across, high across, but then the interesting difference between balanced and strained was this moderate and high notion of endorsement of hypermasculinity. But the most interesting thing here were the percentages. Only 19% of the men were in the distressed group, whereas the largest group was 371 of balanced, and the diffuse group 27. You'll see why that's important in a moment. When we looked at the depression levels of these men, as you can see here, the distressed group had the highest level of depression, but that was accompanied by the highest level of sensitivity to rejection, as well as the lowest level of retaliation restraint. So them perceiving that they could stop themselves from hitting the person on the train who stepped on their shoes. Well, then what does this have to do with going beyond to their behaviors? Because we took a cognitive affective behavioral view here. And so we went first with, this is their affect. So the cognition part are how they view about their identity, their salience. But then this talks about how they're feeling in their everyday lives. Then we talked about violence. So we looked at physical fights, verbal arguments, and weapon use. And what did we find here? Again, the distressed group had the highest level of physical fights, whereas verbal arguments and fights were not very different amongst those groups. But the strained group actually carried weapons the most frequently, had victimized someone with a weapon, or felt like someone was going to victimize them. And so now we start to see a more complex picture of these subgroups of men, and we also get to see how they're distributed across. Now, we find similar results with alcohol use, with the strained group having the highest levels of alcohol use. And then substance use, with the distressed group having the highest level of injected drug use and drug misuse by the Texas Christian University scale. And finally, sexual health risk. Interestingly enough, the diffuse group and the strained group were the groups that we needed to be most concerned of in terms of they report in the diffuse group reported positive condom attitudes and pleasurability, but they were also the group who were most commonly having unprotected sex in the most risky ways. And so really what I'm trying to say here is that our understandings thus far are important, but they really don't paint a full view of what we can understand from the data that we currently have about the lives that young Black men are leading. And so from the foundations that have been presented to us here at ISR, PRBA, University of Michigan, there's just a lot more understanding that we can arrive at if we really think about young Black men as intersectional. And so finally, my dream is really a blueprint for resilient Black manhood. Martin Luther King speaks clearly about the life blueprint and the importance of the life blueprint. As every building has a good foundation, at that foundation, it has to be a good architect. It has to be a plan. And so ideally, I would like first for us to recognize the inherent issues with unidimensional or singular domain analyses, increase our interdisciplinary intentionality, build translational efforts to help help everyday practitioners understand better young Black men, and then finally, really develop a nationally implemented framework for young Black men that acknowledges race, economics, and masculinity. So thank you so much. We are doing so much more of this work here, and I would love to talk to you about it in the future.
Maybe between some activities on campus, but I'm going to ask everybody really quickly just to stand up for a second. I got something for you. I need you. Everybody, do your finger like this. Make a 1. Put it pretty high in the air, and then just wave it around. Knock, knock. Yeah. So make that. That's my intervention for today. All right. We're going to open up for questions and discussion very quickly, but I just want to take a few seconds to do some observations. And the first one is, I'm really impressed with how you answered my charge, and I really appreciate you giving your perspective and talking about these things. So please give the panel a round of applause. I kind of sprung this on them at the last minute, so you did excellent, and I want to thank you again for that. Another thing is what cuts across all these studies is this idea of race, this construction of race, whether it's by experience, skin color, identification, or identity, or whether it's just kind of combination of all three in terms of beliefs. And so just hearing you talk about race, and as a political psychologist, I thought in my mind like how these boundaries that we call disciplines really inhibit our broad understanding of these things as they affect the social world. Most of the literature and kind of models I've kind of referenced very passingly, but my training was not in understanding things through a life course beyond cohort effects in a statistical model or something like that. So it was very refreshing to see, and also disappointing that we have these disciplines. I know we need them, but whatever. The study of the variance within race, I thought was very smart. That is often the case when we look at race, that we just compare blacks and whites, and we kind of ignore the variance that exists within race. That is a system legitimizing myth that exists in most disciplines, that if you're going to study race, you're doing it relative to another race. You can't just study within race, or you're somehow removing variance without understanding things. So I think it's smart for you to continue on that. And the last piece was just about this idea of dreaming, the courage to actually have a dream that matters. And when you think about someone like Martin Luther King in an era of the 1950s and 60s, having an inspiration, a dream, an idea that the world could be a better place, and then pushing that on others and having the courage to do so continuously. But when we're scholars, our dream is just our research agenda. And I say just in the sense that that's what we do. We're just looking forward to the next publication, the next grant dollar, the next pat on the back by a colleague, the next merit appraisal, the next committee that you have to impress. But the thing that should always be motivating us, that gets us up out of bed each day, that helps us write these additional words day in and day out, is this dream that we must have something bigger, some aspiration for society that's bigger than just reading our next publication or patting us on the back. So I want to thank you for offering your dreams and encourage the audience to continue to think about what you do as having a broader mission than just scholarship. Right? So thank you. So I'm happy to open it up now for any questions or comments, and I'll point the finger or pin at someone. Please, don't be shy. I am sorry. That's right.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here and for sharing your expertise and your lived experiences with us. This was an example. I leaned over to my colleague and I said, this is Black excellence. So I may have attributed race, ethnicity to some of you, so I should back that up. It's excellence. We can add Black in there if it applies. So I have a couple of questions. The first one is about how do you navigate self-care as you do this research, because this work isn't easy. The second one is, to other colleagues and scholars that may be in the room, and the hope is always that we learn things and we don't keep the learning to ourselves, that we share it liberally, right? And so 2 panels ago, I went to on this campus at one of the 19 schools and colleges, and it was an all-white panel. And so I wanted to know how you would navigate or what you would share with scholars in terms of if they were invited to speak and the panel looked very homogenic, looked all the same. So whichever question you'd like to address first, anyone's open, but thank you.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, I would hope that I would present the same message, honestly. I think whether my panelists or my colleagues didn't look like me, because I think that by speaking something my mom always says, when you speak truth to it, you give it power and you give it light. And so I would, I think, take the same approach. And in terms of your first question, it's Dr. Hargrove and I were just talking, honestly, when we came in about self-care and the gendered aspect of being an academician. So saying that even some of the Black women scholars that we've looked up to and that we, their work is important. Some have children, most do not. Some, and what does that mean? So even the gendered aspect of being in academia is real. And I think, we were even talking about age, for example, and how that's perceived when you walk into a classroom. And your ability being questioned as a young or Black woman versus an older Black woman. And even when you're older, oftentimes, you're put into this category of this potential, mammy role, right, where you're everybody's mama. And, that even has sort of a historical context and significance to it. So the self-care aspect is real. We see, obviously that across many different health outcomes that basically higher levels of education simply does not translate to better health. And there's a gendered aspect to that for Black men and Black women. And so I just think that as we continue to do this work, even though it's challenging, I think we should also do a better job. I mean, I still have weight on me that I haven't taken off from the phase of moving and the dissertation. And my mom was just saying to me this morning, as I was scrambling to get ready, and she said, baby, I just got to tell you, you just got to go up there and do your best. And you got to do that in every aspect of your life, including how you care for yourself. So that holistic message, I think, is something that we don't really speak about. We only talk about our currency, right? The scholarship, the grants, and we often overlook the body that is here, which, it comes in many facets. So, I'll let my...
Thank you. I wanted to clarify. What would you say specifically to colleagues or scholars that are asked to present and they are white and the panel is white?
No, absolutely. And so to answer that, I say you do it, because it's similar to when you are teaching at a PWI, predominantly white institution. Sometimes it's the white students that need to see you there rather than the Black students. I mean, it's great that Black students can connect with you, come to you. That does add an additional kind of emotional work that you have to do that often goes unrecognized. But a lot of times it can be a lot more powerful for your white students to see that you are in that kind of position. And so if you're asked to be on a panel, which you're most likely going to be, that's mainly white men, let's say, I think you absolutely need to be there to show people a different perspective, right? Because if we're not in these kinds of spaces, the same message is going to be reproduced. And so there needs to be, even if it is a minority voice, it needs to be presented. Even if one person can think differently after that particular panel, I think you've made a difference. So I say, as much of as a burden as it can be, you do it. And I was just going to talk about the conversation we were having about self-care. We're still figuring it out. We're all junior up here, and, they say, take care of yourself, look after yourself. There's also very much so this real pressure to publish or perish if you're on a tenure track kind of occupation. And so, you have to carve out ways and figure it out to, take the day off, go to the gym, cook for yourself, something like that. But it's something that you actively have to work on that I don't know that at least either of us have figured out. I'm not sure if you have or not, but it's super important.
What I'll say in terms of self-care is that I've found, especially coming from the field, that going back to the field and doing translational work is very edifying for me. Because a lot of times in academia, we feel so isolated and alone. Even like the lab, the center that I'm in now, the staff there is amazing. But it's different than being able to go back to the everyday person who is a teacher or a parent and say, these are the things that we found in research. These are ways to help rear your child in a way that you feel more comfortable about their life outcomes at the end of the day. And I think getting that response, because sometimes we can get kind of jaded in the academy. You're like, oh, we heard that, I read that study, and it doesn't have as much of an emphasis as it does when you're talking to someone every single day and you're translating something that honestly most people have never read a psychological article, right? Being able to translate that from what you see every day to their improved practice, at least for me with youth and young men, is so fulfilling. But then the other part about it is that recognizing that the work is a burden on our souls. I remember writing my dissertation, writing about risk and depression and violence among young Black men, and just like going to bed sometimes and be like, I can't do this, because it's just so emotionally overwhelming sometimes. But then remembering the dream, right? Remembering the goal, remembering the prize, which is not the paper. To me, right? My goal is not the paper. Honestly, at the end of the day, the goal, and some of my mentors will tell you, my goal is not the paper. But it is that work going into the field and being able to do that translational work that also helps to lower that emotional burden on me, because I'm not by myself. And the men who I desire to affect every day are saying, thank you for doing that work. And I think sometimes we don't get the gratitude out in here because it's so outcome focused. But sometimes just helping people through the process and learning about themselves has been some of the most edifying for me.
Amazing. Thank you all so very much. I enjoyed all of your presentations. Let me ask you guys a question. My name is Davita Davison, and I am an executive director and social justice activist in Detroit. And I have a nonprofit organization that's called Food Lab Detroit, where I help to build and cultivate a food sovereign Detroit. And I think there's some tension that's getting better between the nonprofit community, particularly those nonprofit organizations that are community-based organizations in what I would call traditionally marginalized community, and academia. And one of the problems that I have is that sometimes academics can create language and narrative that is not reflective of the community that some academics are talking about. In my world, one of the most damning words that came out of academic that was not created by the community is a word called food deserts. That word did not come out of community. That word actually came out of academia. And people who work in community, people who are food activists, community members hate that word, particularly in the city of Detroit, where we have over 1,600 urban farms and gardens. We ain't a food desert. Food grows in Detroit. How we would like to, and how we've started to talk about our community, is we refer to our communities as food apartheids. Because what happened to our communities and neighborhoods, the reason why there is not an abundance of fresh, healthy, affordable food, is because of things and conditions that were beyond our control. Racism, right? So discrimination as it relates to housing, the extraction of resources, the over-proliferation of fast food, unemployment. And so my question to you scholars is, tell me about how you enter community and how do you balance power? How do you talk to community members when you all are doing community-based research and you have to balance their lived experience by what you read in your textbooks? Who has power? How do you take that and perceive that, right? And then how do you go about engaging in communities in the first place? Yeah.
May I? So I think primarily, there may be in some ways, and for some people, because I think it's a negative narrative, right? I'm from a community, right? Meaning when I say that, there have not been a lot of scholars of color and not a lot of diverse representation for a long time from academia to the community, and that is completely understood. but also when we sometimes take on the name academic, right? Because all of us, we're not academic, we're human beings. We were in the community, many of us, before we went into the research, that most of the time, not just on our behalf, but in the community, there's a psychological wall that we built up that we can't seem to talk to one another, except if we go in and we understand each other's stories, right, to begin with. I have found in my work, whether it be on a political campaign, whether it be doing qualitative research, that if I walk in there like I'm an academic, because that has airs and all these other things, then the walls are up. And once you get those emotional walls up, then it's going to be very difficult to commune with people. But if you take off your academic hat and say, like, long before I was Dr. Talley, I was Lloyd, who was working in Upward Bound, right? And I was Lloyd, who was knocking on people's doors. And that helps people to, I think, bridge the gap. And then the language that we use is our language. And I think it's funny, sometimes we feel so bound by our own speech communities that we don't feel the need to translate the things. And I really think that's what it is. Is that when we go into a room and we're not there with a translational hat on primarily, then it automatically sounds like we are academics who are distant, and that disowns the fact of why many of us got into the academy to begin with, was to be able to translate between our communities and the ivory tower, right? And so I think that it's really the humility to share your story and hear stories, but also the desire to go in with the translational hat, that every time you go in the community, it's not a research project. Sometimes you need to do work. Sometimes you need to actually be there to give back to the community that gave to you so that you could be in those academic positions to begin with.
To follow that up, I hear exactly what you're saying. I mean, I also just have less experience actually working with communities in terms of my academic research. So I think that's something that's super important and that's needed. And I think there just needs to be a respect on, especially on the academic side, for people's lived experiences and how precious those things are, and people have to live that every single day. And so to take something, I think it's unfair to take something from a community and not give back in some way, whether that be through an intervention, suggestion, or just working with the community something.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add to that is that I completely agree. I mean, I'm very junior, and so I don't do a lot of community-based work as of yet, but I definitely feel like Healthier Black Elders, which came out of the Institute of Gerontology, but that came from, Black people that worked in the community. James Jackson, Keith Whitfield, these, giants in the field that basically, understood and came in with a very different perception on how they recruit Black participants. And so I 100% agreeing with you. And even going to Detroit, people said to me, "Are you crazy?" It's always a very negative narrative. And since I've been working in Detroit, I just am like, there are so many hidden gems and so many resources. And I see the gentrification right now. I see downtown, Black-owned businesses being pushed out. And it's just disheartening. And I do definitely think that oftentimes we operate so much in a white space when we're in academia. To be honest with you, that translational hat, I think it just sometimes gets set on a shelf. And you operate so much in a white space, and that you just get used to using their language, and you're sometimes afraid to speak up and to be that because you don't want to be perceived as angry or, difficult. These words that they use to describe you, when really you're just as passionate and committed because you know that you came from these cities like Detroit. You know what it's like to have a liquor store on every corner and to be in these neighborhoods. So yes, to hear you say the food desert, I now am aware of it. And I, as a researcher, am going to be even more conscious in how I speak to, even though I don't really study food insecurity or anything like that. But I think it's important, even as we begin to work with the community as researchers and scholars, we need to take ownership of our words and make sure that we empower and not disempower.
Thank you.
Question over here.
Good afternoon. I appreciated all of your presentations, and this question is really for any one of you who'd like to speak to it. Earlier today, I listened to a presentation around Black political solidarity, and one of the concepts that the speaker introduced around attempting to ask the question of who is Black, and race is a theme in all of your research. And he introduced this concept of being black in a thin sense, meaning that you have characteristics, visible physical characteristics that identify you as being black, and black in a thick sense, which he characterized as blackness as that you could, aspects of being black that you could almost subscribe to a greater or lesser degree. And I wondered, in any of your work, have you recognized this distinction, or have you had to recognize it, and how does it impact the conclusions that you may come to?
Thank you for that question. It certainly is something that I grapple with as someone who really wants to break down this super complex, intricate term called race and what that means, especially if we think about how racial categories have shifted over time. And so part of my work is trying to think about how these different indicators of race, whether that be self-identification, skin color, socially identified aspects, how those things differentially influence, in my case, health and well-being. But I think it's something that a lot of times researchers don't pay enough attention to. It's kind of a taken for granted category. We have race, we have black, we have white, we have Asian, and so forth. But I think we do need to come to terms with the fact that race does mean different things in different contexts and in different periods. And it's something that we need to treat as complexly as it is as a concept.
I would just briefly add to that. So the notion of not just selecting a sample of Black men for my study, but rather asking them about their racial ideologies and kind of how aware they are and how much it impacts them was, in my opinion, a step towards being able to understand how someone's own phenomenological viewpoint of how they perceive their race and how they see the world is important, right? Because getting a group of Black men and saying, oh, they're all Black, we don't need to do any race measures, right? Or racial identity measures, that kind of re-homogenizes the group, right? And so I think, I don't know which scholar, made these comments. I think oftentimes in scholarship, we try to make very clear lines, and we like to say high, low, big, small, and hopefully what I tried to do with my study was say, there are probably several different profiles of how people perceive themselves, and they are much more intersectional than if you go to a Black church or you don't go to a Black church, or if you have dark skin or you don't. And so I think if we as scholars are going to really delve deeply into that, one, my work has kind of taken somewhat of a nationalistic bent, meaning I don't really even consider white people in my studies right now, right? I think white people could do the same model of work with white racial identity and femininity and masculinity, and we would not even have to have a cross conversation about this, because we would be designing interventions and plans and policies to impact the individuals who are actually in the group that we were interested in. But I think that sometimes we overbroaden and we overgeneralize so that it's clear for those who are hearing it. But at its core, human life is complex. And so sometimes I think we oversimplify in order to translate. And I know I've been speaking about translation, but then when you get on the ground and talk to people, they say, I don't fit into those two categories. And then you give them the broader perspective, and they're like, I see an aspect of myself there. I see an aspect of myself there. And I think sometimes as academics, we try to dumb things down, to be honest. And we think that that is translating it to other people, when in actuality, they live a complex life every single day. And so we could be a little bit more humble about how we help them to navigate those challenges in research and in the practical space.
I have one, two.
Hi, my name's Yasmin. I'm a first year student in public health and also clinical researcher for the psychiatry department for Michigan Medicine. And in research, I've seen, well, for one, our study is trying to recruit minorities, and it's done online through different survey methods like that. But we found that it's very hard to recruit Black males. And I was wondering from that perspective, because originally I was one of the first Black people on the team and stuff like that. And they were recruiting for alcohol study, and they were recruiting with beer. And I was like, okay, for one thing, maybe put Hennessy on the ad and may geared towards men and things like that. So I was wondering, or towards Black men. I was wondering, when it comes towards recruiting measures, it sounded like yours might have been more in person in the barbershop, but how did you break that barrier? Because there is kind of a stigma around clinical research, especially in the Black community.
It's interesting that when we're doing culturally responsive research or research in communities, that the first question is not the composition of the research team. That's not always the first question. And usually the composition of the research team maybe is a step 2 or 3 question where we realize that the people who got the grant don't look like the community, and now we're scrambling to get those people into there. And it's like, well, if you would have started by, because your research questions are already formulated by the time you're getting a research assistant, which means that you're probably not going to be asking the questions that are really going to get you the answers, because if you don't have the lived experience, then that vantage point is missing oftentimes. Now, what I will say to the recruitment aspect is, yes, we were in barbershops, but we use barbers as natural helpers and mentors, right? The barbers had pre-existing relationships with their clients, and it was through that trust relationship that we bridged the gap. And I also, on the study where that data came from, all of the PIs were African American, everyone on the research team except for, I think, the statistician was African American, and they had been people who had been immersed in the community for years, whether they had gone to the churches, so on and so forth. I think to the point we were making earlier, when I moved to Ann Arbor, I was only in Ann Arbor for 2 months, and then I said, I have to go to the people, so I moved to Detroit, right? And so also having that mentality and that mindset where like, I go to the miner, right? And I talk to people, and my teller at the bank is an African American man who he's in the community that I'm a part, and I'm always asking questions to clarify my own understanding. And so I think it comes in the ideological part, right? First, you need to be getting people on those teams that actually come from the community, and those people can be trained to do this work. And it can be a major economic driver for those communities if they are actually at the table to make those to refine the questions and to do the recruitment. But I think also finding natural helpers. Oh,
let's give her a specific answer.
Oh, sorry. No problem.
Did you offer any incentives to the respondents?
Mm-hmm.
$25.
All right, so you paid them, right? So your team, you were on that team, right? That was offering beer or Hennessy, whichever one you were.
It was like recruiting, like this ads, like that was on it. But yeah, we did like.
So you were a part of the team, so you had diverse membership in the team, but your incentive was even alcohol, right? Did it affect response at all?
Or wait, like it's an alcohol study, so they already were drinkers. But yeah, everyone's incentivized. They didn't really. When we changed the ads, we got a little bit more involvement and things like that. But still, there was this kind of disconnect of people not really engaging, like when it comes to Black men.
So you know what's interesting is that we can all have perspectives on these things, but we know that this is about rapport. It's about costs and benefits of responding and participating. So what's interesting is you can actually craft a study around survey response that is just as important as the substance of what you want to study with your survey itself. So that survey methodological research is something that we can all explore and study, see what's most effective. There is no silver bullet to this kind of thing, so it's very study specific. So I didn't mean to cut you off, but we got one more.
Thank you. So all of your research was really interesting and exciting to learn about. I'm interested in health disparities, which you all kind of touched on. So my question is, a lot of time politicians and lawmakers aren't really eager to hear about these social health differences and not ready to actually have policy that reflects that. So how do you go about in your research having these results impact the policy that's going to create change, especially with health disparities?
Deanna, you want to take that?
Oh, sure. That's a great question. My work feels like it's really timely now because of the influx of money into Alzheimer's research. And so that's for many different reasons. So in terms of how it affects policy, I didn't go into studying cognition, right, to ultimately try to do something with Alzheimer's. But everyone has said, oh, this is where the policy is going, this is where the money is. And so I guess the short answer is make sure that your passion and your heart is in what you're doing. I think that can span most of the questions asked today and how we responded, that if you're not really committed to the community that you're working with and you don't really have something invested in it beyond just getting publications, the community is going to know that. And I think if you're fortunate enough, it's difficult to think we can impact policy at our work, but I think you can, in terms of how we translate it and the way that we share it in the venues. And so I do think I was at first kind of resistant to working with the Alzheimer's Association, but they have a huge impact on policy. They lobby quite a bit. AARP, huge impact. So I kind of broadened my perspective in thinking about who do I target, because oftentimes I think sometimes I just say, well, I just really want to go and help older Black people who, you know, are struggling to age in place. And I sometimes think very myopically. And so I've kind of begun to broaden that and realizing that if I'm not at the table and I'm not saying how we should be studying cognition or cognitive health in Alzheimer's research and not just getting the money, and if I'm not at the table really translating how we then think about AARP and these other institutions and nonprofits, then I will definitely have not a no impact on policy. So that's sort of the approach that I take.
Sorry.
Hello. My name is Amber Bryant. I'm a recent PhD graduate myself, 2018, so I'm also a new scholar. I did want to make a point kind of to the terminology that's being used in some of the narratives. When I graduated, according to the Census Bureau, only 0.06% of the U.S. population were Black doctors, and that's PhD, DD, JD, MD. So, we're definitely not writing the narrative. And I think we're just now getting to the point where we're influencing and shaping that narrative. So, kind of like you said, our voices are just now getting to the point where we can be heard. My question for you is, I notice sometimes when I am presenting my research, and I was told this by one of my white colleagues, he said that when he talks about it, as a white male, when he talks about racial disparities or racial inequities, that he's considered progressive. But when I talk about it, people can consider me as angry, or that's a given. Of course, she's going to, talk about those issues. So when I heard that, it was kind of, it's a little disheartening that when I speak on our issues as African Americans, it has a little less validity. Have you all experienced that? And if so, how do you combat that so that we sound just as valid and progressive as a white man would?
Well, first of all, congratulations. That's no easy feat. But yeah, that's definitely something that you experience. Not only are they seen as more progressive, but it's also kind of seen as more groundbreaking. So there's a lot of things that community members have been saying for years and people have been experiencing for years. And when scholars say it, particularly white scholars or whoever has particular types of privilege, it becomes more heard, right? And so I think even grappling with that myself in my work, in terms of thinking about skin color differences among African Americans. We've always known that, especially if you've been a light-skinned, dark-skinned, right, African American, particularly woman. And so on the one hand, I think just recognizing the privilege that you do now have as someone with higher levels of education and how you can use that to be a voice for people who aren't as, respected, for lack of a better word, at least until we change the types of systems that need to be changed in order to combat that. But on the other hand, I think, it's just persevering. It's going to happen in terms of someone being seen as more progressive or more legitimate or, more competent. But I would hope that doesn't steer you away, because you're needed in this profession, in any kind of academic, political space. So, I mean, I think it goes back to self-care, which what someone else asked about, but it's something that, you deal with, unfortunately, until things change. It's going to be a thing, and you just do what you need to do, take care of yourself, and keep going.
There's a question.
Thanks. Hi, thanks for your presentations. Very interesting concepts you presented. First, my background is white boomer, medical doctor, taking care of rural veterans, 99% white, in California. Anyway, that's where I'm coming from. And those veterans were in really bad state of health. My concern is projecting 10 years from now. We have a lot of disparities in health now. Not only black and white, but lesbian, gay versus straight, and men versus women, rural versus urban. All of those variables are really important. But I'm back in Ann Arbor for a while, and I've been attending some lectures called Precision Health. So for people who have really good insurance and lots of money, the advances in genetic testing and all that are really potentially going to add years and years of life to people who can afford it. But then at the same time, we see the federal government attacking the Affordable Care Act, degrading nutrition requirements in schools. And if we continue along this track, it seems to me that we're going to see even worse healthcare disparities in 10 years than we see right now. So I just want to know how you are going to approach that and how we're going to stop it, because if we don't give that kind of equal access to everybody, the progress that we're making at the best ends of science here in the University of Michigan, we're going to see 30 years of disparity in Baltimore, not 20. Anyway, those are my thoughts.
That's a very good question. It's a complex one. I mean, I think it kind of goes back to somewhat, I mean, we need to be thinking about policy. I mean, and we need to be thinking about things like voting rights. And, I mean, I think for the first time, if I'm not mistaken, the Supreme Court just decided to look at the Electoral College and how that's decided. So clearly, the political landscape is, I think, really the venue that we need to be thinking about, because that's really where policy trickles down. That's how resources are allocated. Most of these institutions, academic ones anyways, run off of federal dollars, and those are determined by Congress. So you're right. I mean, healthcare and so many things are under attack, and I think as academicians, we do sometimes feel powerless, but we also have privilege in that, especially once you get tenure, right? You have some political stance. Most people don't know that. So hence why my vision around promotion and tenure of more people of color and more marginalized individuals, veterans, and, people from the gay and LGBT communities and other groups, women, because without voices, a collectiveness and a diverseness in the voices, then the groups that continue to get heard are white males that are rich and that are continued to be privileged. So, I don't really have a singular answer, because I think it's going to be a multifaceted approach. I think we need to advocate that people are involved in the political system. I think we need to think about nonprofits that have similar missions or similar visions, or maybe that don't, but we need to be the voice that sort of guides them into saying, maybe we can tackle this or we can partner. I think we need to have a community stance when we go out to the communities as researchers and we're recruiting. We need to inform everyone around sort of everything else that they're facing and that they're dealing with, because the research is going to continue to be there. And we know that even if they do away with the Affordable Care Act, we don't know what the outcome of that is yet, right? That's yet to be determined. So unfortunately, you're presenting a bleak picture, but it's maybe a very real one, that the disparities will get worse. And so I think that how we approach this, and then of course the collaborations. I don't think we think about that enough, because we focus so much on our own work, but how can we maybe join and merge teams? I know as researchers, it sometimes feels like we're really strapped with time and we're asked to be on so much and to do so much, but how we can collaborate with each other. You in California and here in Michigan, what are the similarities there, and maybe what are some ways that we can tackle it collectively? I think it's a collective problem, so it's going to take a collective solution.
I'll just add, as a resident political scientist, and I see Dr. Traggett back there in the back, is leaning back, wondering about this. We study, those of us who study democracy really struggle with these choices that society has to make about what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad. The things you say are just, someone else could say are an injustice. The focus on race may be something that is important to some, or disparities. To others, it distracts from the importance of the whole. So I think the picture we discuss is one that is a challenge for this generation to really consider the extent to which privilege is a right or a wrong thing. And you can think about it, whether students here at the University of Michigan feel like they may deserve something more than the student at Michigan Tech. deserves. And so we should not assume that everyone sees justice in the same way and right in the wrong in the same way. So I want to encourage the research to continue, because ultimately it will show what's important for the outcomes in society. But there is unfortunately no inherent belief that everyone is deserving of the same outcomes, and that's why our work and the work of Dr. King brought this about. There's not a silver bullet here, and it's not meant for everyone in society to be at the same level. So I hate to paint that picture, but that's where we are. There was a question right here. I'm sorry, right behind you. And this will be the last question because we have a reception afterwards. I'm sorry.
Thank you again for the presentations. And might be an overly broad question, but just trying to synthesize, I think, something that all the presenters did about inter and intragroup differences. Certainly intersectionality, I think, was in there for everyone. And might be overly broad to ask, like, what do you see, and kind of piggybacking on these later questions, interesting next new directions for research, at least for you guys personally, your own work or what you're seeing, where you're at, and any policy interfaces, like kind of idea that we might, a lot of cases I think, need universalistic policies, but with this level of intergroup differences, intersectionality, probably some targeting, whether that's race, class, gender, what have you, and maybe look very different issue by issue, but or domain by domain, but anything like that, again, maybe a overly broad couching, but at least anything you see as interesting next steps, direction or policy-wise, as you said, Lloyd, translational research, at least your own kind of corners of the world.
Yeah, thank you. I think for me personally, the next steps that I'm interested in have to do with contextualizing the disparities we already see. And so like some of the slides that I showed before, what do these things mean in different kinds of neighborhoods where people grow up? Is there something about what we would consider a disadvantaged neighborhood, at least economically, that could be somehow beneficial? And some of my other lines of work, I actually am finding that there is a physical health benefit for medium-skinned African Americans who grow up in a high proportion Black neighborhoods, right? Neighborhoods that we would generally consider to be disadvantaged and leading to ill health given different socioeconomic issues. But there's something about growing up around other Black people that was beneficial for one's health. So for me, really thinking about how the surrounding environment can change the meanings and the consequences of our identities, whether they be skin color, race, gender, things like that. And I think in terms of your question about policy, we have to be very deliberate with what our policy implications are, because it's easy, I think, for policymakers on either side to take a finding and run with it and interpret it in the way that they that would best fit their agenda. So, for example, I'm thinking about some of the work I'm interested in looking at social mobility and health. So thinking about how social mobility for Black Americans is actually linked to worse health. And so an easy kind of probably right-wing interpretation of that would be, oh, well, Blacks just shouldn't be socially mobile, when it's more about the toxicity in the environments that lead to that pathogenic effect, right? And so I think we just have to be very explicit about the policy implications of our work, and noting, especially for intersectionality scholars, that it's likely not going to be a one-prong approach. So one policy that works for that is intended to work for all Black Americans is likely not going to succeed, because there is so much heterogeneity within that population group and all population groups.
I'll just briefly pick up on that. I think the question that you're asking is the question that I started my work with, which was, if we are going to build a national program for Black boys, how do we reach all the different types of Black boys that there may be? And so I think moving beyond the disparities approach alone, I think disparities helps us know where we are and how far we have to go, but it doesn't really have kind of a social group focus, right? There are unique contextual things that occur for different social groups in our world. And so rather than studying them based off of their individual axes of identity, studying them as a social group who are experiencing the same the same potential for marginality, but experiencing it in different ways, I think helps us to get to a place where focusing within the group and how different, how individuals within one social group are experiencing the same challenges differently will help us to target nuanced approaches to saying, okay, well, every young Black man is not going to have high sexual health risk. And so putting a sexual health risk program in a high school that's not targeted to individuals who are actually facing high level of sexual health risk may, from a policy angle, not actually be the most efficient policy, because there will be a large group of boys who are getting programming that they may not necessarily need, right? And so I say, yes, keep going with intersectionality, with disparities approaches to understand how far we have to go, but then we have to go the next step to do within group analyses without even really considering where the other social groups fall, because the factors, there may be some universal factors for people that push their well-being, but within groups, there are specific factors that help them. And I think we have to focus more on figuring out what the specific within group factors are at this point in time, rather than consistently just saying there is a disparity, because at this point in time, we know that that's racism, right? That's the process of racism. It creates disparities.
Yeah, I mean, I clearly take a similar approach where I do a lot of within group. I mean, I started early on, with the between group approach and just looking at Black, white, and now I am focused on the social milieu of really just older Black Americans and even in midlife. I think another big thing is really this aspect of resilience. I mean, there are older Black people who live to, this mortality crossover effect, right? So there is something that, allows Black people to survive in spite of all of these challenges that they've had in their life. And, that really is sort of my next lens of research, is to thinking about a sort of